Greetings, Corpse Clubbers, and welcome to a brand new episode of Corpse Club, the official podcast for DailyDead.com. My name is Heather Wixson, and for this week, I am joined by screenwriter, producer, director. I mean, you're pretty much you've done it all. I think your time in Hollywood. I'm speaking about Jared Rivet, who is joining us today. Thank you so much, Jared.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm really excited. And you know what? It's funny that you rattle all those things off as though there are like these accomplishments where I can just check them off a list, and yet I feel like I still have a whole bunch of things that I haven't done yet, and I am still the reach exceeds the grasp, as they say.
I think there's a lot of us that feel that way, but you know what? That just motivates us to keep going, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Because what else are we going to do right now, right?
Exactly. But I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So for this week's episode, we're going to be diving into Tobe Hooper's 1979 miniseries of Salem's Lot, which just coincidentally popped up on Shudder, which sort of I was like, all right, this is a good time to talk about Salem's Lot. Not that there's ever a bad time.
Nope.
And as you pointed out, as we were chatting earlier this week, that as we are recording this is the anniversary of the air date for part one of Salem's Lot, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, November. So yeah, we're recording this on November 17th. And the weirdest thing about the miniseries aspect of this was that night 2 didn't come on for another week.
Could you imagine? Because I grew up during the time when miniseries, when they were in 2 or 3 parts, they aired, night after night after night.
Right.
For me to air part 1 of a mini series and then wait a whole week, that'd be torture.
Yeah. It's weird too, because it was only 2 nights. You would think a 2-night miniseries would be, Wednesday and Thursday or Thursday and Friday or something like they would know back in the day, back in the 70s and the 80s, they would run things on Friday nights and Saturday nights. But yeah, you would really think that they would have done that. But I don't know what the thinking was about staggering it by a week. I know that night 2 was huge because of the stagger. So it worked ratings wise. So
CBS must have known what they were doing, I guess.
I guess.
So don't listen to us. We don't know what we're talking about. So
no,
yes.
Not at all.
Yeah, so I think I might be a few years younger than you because I did not see this when it first aired, but I did watch it when I was about 6 years old on VHS. Were you one of the people who got to see it on the air?
Yes.
Ooh,
yeah. And so, I mean, look, I was, I guess 6 or 7. So I was right around the same age that you were when you saw it. I will say that I was traumatized. And that it scared the shit out of me. And it was the same stuff that whenever anybody talks about being traumatized by it, especially if they saw it when they were a kid, it's the Glick boys at the window, scratching at the window in both of those scenes. And it was I can't find any record of this, at least not on the internet, but I remember it being, and maybe it was just a local thing. Maybe it was just a write-up in the local newspaper where I'm from in Massachusetts. But I remember it being controversial because it was a primetime TV show. And again, in the 70s, TV was very sanitized and very safe.
Yeah.
Now, you got scary stuff, especially in the 70s. I love the 1970s horror TV movies. There is no better era for horror television, as far as I'm concerned, as far as horror TV movies of this ilk, than the 70s, because they had that weird kind of vibe to them. It's an inexplicable. It's just a flavor. So you would have things like Night Gallery or Trilogy of Terror or Night Stalker or Kolchak, and they would deliver the goods, but. I think so. My memory of it was that after night 1, there was a huge outcry from parents because it was what was on in primetime on CBS that night. And by the time you've got dead little boys with glowing eyes floating outside the window in fog, scratching at the window, there were children screaming and running through the room, it was absolutely terrifying. And I remember there being newspaper articles about there are people letter writing and parents groups being up in arms and really upset about the fact that it came on regular television. And that's what you get when you hire the
Tobe
man who
Hooper.
directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to direct your TV movie adaptation of a Stephen King novel.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It seems like, because Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I know when it came out was very controversial.
Huge.
But immediately, like when you go back and look at it now in retrospect, it's kind of funny because it's largely bloodless. You know, so much of the violence is implied in that movie. And it was actually one of the no movies in my house. Like my mom, I grew up with a single mom who pretty much let me watch anything. Like she took me to movies a lot when I was young because she just didn't have money for a sitter. So like I saw American Werewolf in London in a theater in 1981 when I was 3 years old. Not a movie I would say take your 3-year-old to. So like there was very, very few sort of things that I was not allowed to watch. Texas Chainsaw was one of them. The Exorcist was the other because she was convinced it was real.
Right. Yeah.
So
I was raised Catholic. So The Exorcist was kind of flat, was a flat no. And we didn't watch The Omen either, interestingly enough, but all the other ones were fine. It was interesting. I have a very similar experience. I have this memory of going to the drive-in with my parents and cowering in the back seat for a double feature of Carrie and Halloween.
Oh my God, that's amazing though.
And oh my God. And it just, I was I've already used the word traumatized. I have to come up with something else. I was petrified. I could hear, and I was just cowering in the back seat with my hands over my ears, and the John Carpenter score and Carrie's hand coming up out of the grave at the end of Carrie. And it just, it did me in. And I think that what happened with Salem's Lot was it really, the difference between something that is like a kinder trauma and Salem's Lot is that like Salem's Lot really messed people up. Like it was way too scary for television. And it's funny, I was in researching us having this discussion, I went back and looked at a lot of stuff, and I always forget that Salem's Lot was the first Stephen King TV adaptation, and then it was the only Stephen King miniseries for like 11 years.
Wow.
Because they didn't do another one until It.
Yeah, I guess that would be correct. Because I was trying to think about it. And when I was thinking about like Stephen King miniseries, because those to me were just like, between, growing up in Salem's Lot. Yeah. Anticipating the release of It. Talking about kinder trauma, even though I was 12 when that movie came out, that still messed me up. And then like The Stand came out when I was in high school. Right. It's really interesting to me that maybe it was like they had to back off of horror.
I don't know, but it's fascinating to me because like you, I have like fond memories of all of those summers where Stephen King miniseries would come out in June. They would be, and you'd set the VCR and so to me, it's like Stephen King almost. I mean, granted, it's kind of he's a cottage cheese industry. Of his own right. But, with film, I mean, I grew up on my whole Creepshow is my all-time favorite horror movie. And so like, I'm someone that was raised on Stephen King adaptations for film. But when you think of Stephen King, a lot of what you think about is TV. And the fascinating thing was that we had the second adaptation ever of a Stephen King novel was done for TV. And then there was nothing on television, basically. I mean, there was like a Tales from the Dark Side. There were, the Twilight Zone, the 85 Twilight Zone, things like that. But as far as the miniseries format, as far as the big event miniseries format thing that when you think of it, you go back and you think, okay, there's Tommy Knockers and, all these other shows, Rose Red, and it's like, oh, okay, well, there were a ton of these, but it's like, yeah, but there weren't any throughout the 1980s.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But I think Salem's Lot, kind of did a lot of heavy lifting for that generation because I think, the advent of VHS tapes and things like that. Yeah. And you mentioned, of course, the Glick Boys being so traumatizing. Yeah. And for me, like, I don't remember if I joked with you or if it was because Scott Drevitt was supposed to join us for this episode, but poor Scott's working tonight. Yes. But it's one of those things, like, I think after seeing Salem's Lot, I don't think I have ever slept with the curtains open in my window this very day. So
I think I told you. So I tell the story all the time about how I spent 2 years in the late 2000s working with Tobe Hooper on an unrealized remake of White Zombie, the Bela Lugosi White Zombie, and very, very sad, great story. It's very. There was I did a whole other podcast interview just about that whole debacle. But I got to know Tobe really well, and actually Tobe was the first person that was attached to direct Jackals, the
Oh,
feature.
interesting.
Yeah, so that would have been a Tobe Hooper movie had we gotten it made 8 years earlier, 7 years earlier. But anyway, I got to work with him, and we worked together really closely on several projects, including those two for pretty much 2 years straight. And so we would more often than not talk on the phone. It was kind of his preferred. He liked talking on the phone, and he was a fax machine guy. But I would often just kind of get him going about Funhouse, get him going about Poltergeist, get him going about Salem's Lot. And the anecdotes would just flow for like 15 or 20 minutes straight until we got back to work. And so I, at one point, told him that Salem's Lot messed me up, that Salem's Lot literally traumatized me, like not in a fun way, not in a great way. And he just laughed. He laughed, and he chuckled, and he said, "Well, sorry, dude." And it was so perfect. It was such his timing of sorry, dude was. And I said, you know what? There's nothing for you to be sorry about. If you had not made that movie, we might not be sitting here having this conversation right now. And it messed me up in all the right ways. And it's funny because I feel like Poltergeist had as much of a formative impact. So I feel like Salem's Lot and Poltergeist really did kind of put that into, along with Creepshow, really hit me in a way that turned me into a horror fan. But I mean, then I can kind of look at George Romero, and I can look at Halloween, and I can look at all the formative stuff that was going on. I happened to be a kid at a really, really good time for horror. But Salem's Lot was not supposed to be that fucking scary. It just wasn't. And, the package, the box was not labeled properly. They did not warn us ahead of time that we were going to get something so scary, because if there's one thing that works, every single scare sequence in the Salem's Lot miniseries works.
It really
I don't think
does.
If you're talking about pure effectiveness of sequences, there isn't a flat scare. And there are scares in Salem's Lot that are not even vampire scares. They're not horror scares. There's the bit where Ned Tibbets pops out from behind the door, and that room, that partition.
Room. Yeah.
Yeah, that room divider partition. And my God, that is a jump scare and a half.
Yeah.
And it's just a jealous boyfriend popping out to beat the shit out of somebody. It's not even, we've gotten so many other scarier moments that are really, really terrifying. But I mean, even the scares that are just kind of disturbing, or the scares that are just there to drive other parts of the plot, are equally frightening. Yeah. And so it's one of those movies that and I guess, as the writer, John Kenneth Muir, wrote a book called Eaten Alive at a Chainsaw Massacre, and it's all about Tobe's filmography. It's about 10 or 12 years old at this point. And he always talks about Tobe's kind of his style, which is that all bets are off when you're watching a Tobe Hooper movie. Mm-hmm. And I think that Salem's Lot kind of exemplifies that in much the same way that Texas Chainsaw does, that Poltergeist does, that any of his movies do, where you're not safe as an audience member.
Yeah,
where
you're not.
You can be attacked basically by the movie without knowing it. Like, there are ways that a filmmaker will meet you halfway, or that a film will, it'll sign a contract with you, an agreement with you. And Tobe says, fuck all that.
Yeah.
Shit is going to pop up into frame from out of nowhere and scare the shit out of you with no prior setup, no expectation. And you know what? Too bad. You're gonna love this. It's gonna mess with you, and you're gonna love it. But that's what
Yeah, I was gonna say, speaking to what you mentioned, obviously, this is a movie very much driven by the vampire elements, but like for
Yeah.
me, like the human elements to it as well,
Yeah.
really is what makes this one of my favorites to kind of revisit a time and time again. Like, I think for me, when I think of like quintessential Stephen King adaptations, I
Hmm.
always go back, and they may not be the quote unquote best.
Right.
But I think for when you're trying to capture what a Stephen King story feels like, for me, I really feel like Salem's Lot does it well. I think I think Silver Bullet does it extremely well. And I even
Mm.
say like It Part One does it extremely well too.
Yeah.
Where it really it brings to life this whole community. Like you
Yes.
feel like once you start watching these movies that you're part of this little town
Yep.
and you're connecting with all these little characters and everything like matters. And I think
Yep.
especially in Salem's Lot.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
yeah, when you talk about like the human elements, like for me, like I actually think one of the scariest sequences in the entire movie is the scene when Cully Sawyer comes home to
Mhm.
find Fred Willard's Larry Crockett in bed with his wife Bonnie.
Right. Oh God.
And that whole sequence to me is probably one of the most terrifying
Oh
in the
God.
entire movie because like it is just like a ticking time bomb, that
Well,
entire sequence.
and it's wild because that, and I never really thought about it before, but like I said, I was kind of doing a lot of reading and a lot of digging up of old articles and a lot of Googling and reading old reviews and stuff today just to kind of get a sense of like, okay, where were things when Salem's Lot came out and what kind of context. And one of the things that came up a lot was that the Cully Sawyer, Boom Boom Bonnie, Fred Willard plot line doesn't really have a whole hell of a lot to do with the rest of the show.
Nah, not really.
And I never really stopped to think about the fact that it doesn't. I mean, it does when you boil it down. There's so much about what happens with Jeffrey Lewis and with Ned Tebbets, with Mike Ryerson and Ned Tebbets when they go to the house that would not have happened if Cully had gone, and then Fred Willard's character ends up, getting the big freeze frame claw to the face, his death.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it is important. And then one of the other things that's always been fascinating to me about the miniseries version is that there was also the 2-hour European theatrical version, which was released on VHS here in the States. It's not available digitally. I don't think it's available on DVD. It only came out on VHS. It was called, when they released it here on tape, it was called Salem's Lot the Movie. And they had cut the 3 hours down to just under 2 hours. But the weird thing about that version is that Tobe had to shoot gore. He had to shoot gorier R-rated sequences to supplement some of the deaths and supplement some of the moments so that they were a little bit, so they had more of an edge to them, that it wasn't just 1970s standards and practices network television, so that they could release it overseas as an intense R-rated horror movie. And so the miniseries version that we have now on Blu-ray and on Shudder is the miniseries cut with the gore stuff cut into it, which is interesting, except for that scene. Now, and maybe you're aware of this. I'm sure you must be, because I know that I've read some of your stuff about Salem's Lot, and I know that you've been obsessed with Salem's Lot for a long time. But this, in the Salem's Lot the movie, in the hour and 49-minute cut, in the scene where George Zunza is holding the double barrel shotgun up to Fred Willard's face. Mm-hmm. In the shorter cut, he forces Fred Willard to put the barrels of the gun into his mouth.
Yeah.
And Tobe, I think, mentions in the commentary, and I'd asked him about why, like what was where did that go, and why is it not, like, why was it in one version and not the other? And it's not in the streaming version. It's not in the miniseries digital, the version that we watch. It's still just him holding the barrels up to his face. And I guess the idea is that it was so disturbing, and it is. I mean, it's terrifying, and it's gross, and it's weird, and it's phallic, and this, he's got the guy that's been, cuckolding him, at gunpoint, and he basically, his oral, weirdness where he sticks the gun barrel into the guy's mouth. He said that it was too much of a freak out, and that to then have immediately after that the shock cut of Barlow getting Fred Willard, they were too close together. And so he cut out, but I've always really liked the shotgun in the mouth. I think the shotgun in the mouth is so disturbing and so Tobe.
Yeah.
That I really wish that either there was an alternate cut or I just wish it was in there. But he had his reasons. And I mean, that's the thing with Tobe. He always, any alternate cut of anything, I had long conversations with him about Life Force and about all of that stuff. And I mean, he always had a logic behind why something would be, cut from one version but put back in another or whatever the case was. But yeah, that shorter cut was really fascinating because it completely the Guatemala bookends. They were not incorporated at all. They weren't. It didn't start and end in Guatemala. And the Guatemala stuff has often been, and I think it was true. I don't think that this is made up. It was in case they wanted. It was kind of a backdoor pilot thing.
Oh.
Where Ben Mears and Mark Petrie would continue on in a TV show hunting vampires across the globe.
I would have watched that.
Of course you would have. And I don't know why it never happened. I don't, again, like the show was really controversial. The miniseries was really controversial. So I don't know why they wouldn't have, because I know it was a big hit. But they cut that stuff, they cut it down to the bone for the 2-hour version. And the 2-hour version was also ran on cable as a movie. But it was an interesting kind of, but yeah, I think you would be really frustrated by it. Have you not seen that shorter cut?
Speaking of when you were talking about the shotgun scene, that sort of like clicked some memories. And I think that's actually the first version I ever saw. Because
it was on cable. It was readily available. It was available to rent, and it came on cable that way. I mean, it's yet another one of these instances where we have, alternate cuts of things available on Blu-ray, or versions of things that we never thought we were going to get to see, or a director finally got to go back and do their version of whatever. And so it's a really interesting time because, the only version of Salem's Lot that we had for a while. And I remember when they put out a two-tape VHS version of the miniseries version, they might have even called that Salem's Lot the miniseries, just so that they could put them on the shelf side by side and not, confuse. Well, it's confusing to do that, but, have the two versions for sale, so you could buy either the 2-hour one or the 3-hour one. But yeah, I think that it was readily available. It's just too bad that something like Scream Factory or someone hasn't gotten a chance to put out a version that has, both cuts. I would really like to watch that shorter cut again.
Yeah, because the first time I saw it, we saw it at my best friend's house, and her dad always had a friend that would tape stuff off of cable for him, and then he'd bring home a VHS tape with a few movies on it. That's how we would watch a lot of stuff, because we didn't have cable where we grew up. So I'm pretty sure that had to be the first time I saw it. And then when I got a little bit older, and I started buying VHS tapes, I bought the 2 VHS tape set.
Yep.
And I was so excited because I realized that was a bigger version than I had seen. And then it was, of course, that was the version that kind of glommed onto me over the years.
Right. Oh, and so that was the thing. That's exactly where, it's funny because you actually triggered my point, which was the VHS version was the miniseries version. It did not have the extra gore, and it had the tags. It had the ending credits for part 1.
Yes.
And I think it had the recaps and stuff. So those things we don't have anymore. Also, and I love the kind of 3-hour version, but it's interesting because it doesn't have the ending, the very end of part 1, because it just kind of fades to black and dissolves to the next scene from part 2.
Part 2, yeah. And
there are a couple of little changes. The gore, the R-rated gore has been, cut back into it. But yeah, that VHS version was really interesting because it was in fact longer, mostly because it had 2 sets of credits and, different, it had the recap of everything in part 2. So yeah, really interesting because I was looking it up today and there are 4 different running times for this movie. And I was like, wait a minute, there can't be. And I was like, nope. Okay. And then as I read about what the different cuts were, I was like, oh, okay. That makes total sense. Nope. Yep. That makes total sense. So yeah, the reason that there are 4 different running times is because of these different editions that have come out. But yeah, so the version that's on Blu-ray and that's on Shudder and that you can buy on iTunes and on Vudu and Amazon is a little different from any of the versions that anybody saw back in the day.
Yeah, it's what's interesting to me is because like I love sort of like the history of how these projects come together, because I know this was something that like, you know, went through a lot of iterations before they finally got to what we see now, you know, as the miniseries. And I always found it really fascinating that Larry Cohen had been involved with a version of the script since he went on to do Return to Salem's Lot.
Right.
Which, God bless that movie. Like, it's so ridiculous, but I kind of love it. I don't know how to explain it. Like, I don't love it as a sequel to this movie, but I love it on its own, if that makes any sense.
It's so much fun. No, and I find the whole background, I mean, I feel like we get all these books now about, you know, the Halloween projects that never got made, or the Nightmare on Elm Street projects that never got made. But the weirdest thing about Salem's Lot is that there was like a 4-year period where they were trying to get this made. And I mean, not only did guys like John Carpenter and George Romero and Tobe was on for a feature version at one point with William Friedkin producing.
Wow.
But the people came and went on the feature version. But what was the most fascinating, I think the thing that I am always in awe of was that Warner Brothers saw Martin. They saw George Romero's Martin, and they said, this is the guy. This is a really great vampire movie, and it's set in a small town in the modern day. This is the guy that we need to direct the movie version of Salem's Lot. And at their expense, they flew Romero to Stephen King to Maine so that they could meet and discuss it. And that's how they met.
Wow.
And so Salem's Lot, the aborted George Romero, Stephen King version of Salem's Lot, is the reason that we have Creepshow and you know, and that relationship. But yeah, they were really kind of, the studio was really trying to make that happen. They really wanted to be in the George Romero business. And they were very serious about doing a 2-hour feature version of Salem's Lot. But what they kept learning every time they hired a new high profile screenwriter to come in was that they could not boil it down to 2 hours. And yeah, like I said, Tobe, when Tobe came out, the interesting thing about Salem's Lot with Tobe is that it was a game changer for him. Tobe was having no luck at all after Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was wild because it was a huge success.
Yeah.
Became a name brand overnight. But he was this auteur weirdo from Texas, and everybody assumed he was Charles Manson. They assumed it was real, and they assumed he was some guy that was out, you know, cutting people up in the backwoods of Texas somewhere. And so the person that kind of plucked him out of obscurity, that kind of said, "Hey, look, you need to come out to Hollywood," was William Friedkin. Strangely enough. And so Friedkin basically got him set up in Hollywood. And what ended up happening was Hollywood almost destroyed Tobe before he'd even gotten anywhere. Eaten Alive, he got fired. You know, he quit Eaten Alive. He got fired or quit off of The Dark, which was another movie. And so, and years of nothing. Like, he basically, between Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Salem's Lot, you have one finished movie and things that he was either getting fired off of or things that he was developing that weren't going anywhere. And so the fascinating thing about Salem's Lot was that was his calling card for Hollywood, not Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because it proved that A, he could work within the system, and B, he could work with big stars, C, he could work on budget and on schedule, and that, you know, what letter am I on? D. That it would be something that would work. Like, and it came out and it was scary and it was effective and it caught a lot of people's attention. But he had to basically reprove himself after Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Which blows my mind.
It's amazing. But it's something, if you go back and read anything, he talks about how relieved this was a safety net. This was a parachute. He was dying out here. He had nothing going on and was just going into one bad situation after another and not being able to make anything work. And then he got this, and this completely changed his career.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's great too, because like the one thing that sort of bugs me, and maybe it's because I'm older, but because like there's been a lot of discourse online over the last like week or so since Shudder added Salem's Lot, which has been amazing for me. Like I'm so grateful that
I love it.
that people are out there talking about it. But I do see a lot of like younger people saying how they find it to be very slow.
Yeah.
And to me, that is a bummer.
Right. Yeah. And there's nothing you can do about that. There's nothing you can do about that.
I mean, I get it because
Yeah.
it's, they're not used to that pacing, but it's like one thing, it's like you have a 2-night miniseries. The pacing is going to be more deliberate. It's going to take its time. It's going to breathe a little bit.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, it takes forever for vampires to show up. And I'm like, but that's for me, like, I'm okay with that because I'm settling with all of these characters.
Yeah.
I want to watch Ben Mears go and court a lovely Bonnie Bedelia, and I want to watch.
She's so gorgeous in this movie. She's so beautiful.
She's ethereal. Like I love her in this. And like, I want to see like these, like the little back and forth between all these different characters. And I want to get to know, Jeffrey Lewis's dog. And, it's like, there's so, to me, I'm like, I don't see it the way that like these darn kids on my lawn see it. But I always want to remind them like, the pacing is there for a reason.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
To like get to that stuff because for me, or I mean, I guess not for me, but like I've only read Salem's Lot, the book, twice. And once when I was like a little kid and once like a few years ago. But the thing is like, this is like a stagnant evil that has just sort of lived dormant in this town for years beyond vampire, before Barlow shows up.
Right.
And Straker. And it's all sort of culminated in this house.
Right.
And so for me, like the atmosphere is what really sells this. Like I love the vampire stuff. Don't get me wrong. That's believe me, it's all good. But like for me, it's just that creeping dread that happens from the very moment, like within the first like 90 seconds of this movie, as Ben Mears comes up on the Marsten House, and looks at it, everything is wrong. You know from that moment that this movie is just bad things are coming and bad things are already there.
Absolutely.
And, and it's like, I just want to keep reminding like the younger people, like, it's okay to have a little patience with a movie because that payoff is coming.
Oh yeah. Like, well, and it's, and I there's so much to unpack with what you just said, but I mean, I love that it's a kind of, you don't really know what the threat is for a really long time. It seems like it's going to be a haunted house movie.
That is very true.
And it is. You know what? I will argue that it is a haunted house movie. But, in terms of like, okay, what subgenre of horror movie are we watching for the first 45 minutes? It's like, well, there's a serial killer who's killing children and it's tied to this haunted house. And it's like, okay. And then it's, oh, yeah, by the way, vampires. But then what's wild about the slow pace and about the kind of soap opera-y kind of aspect of the small town life and all the gossip and all the, everybody's judging everybody and watching everybody and knows everybody. I love, one of the things that I pick up on every time I watch it is that everybody always seems to know what everyone else's business is.
Oh yeah.
There's a point in the movie.
Social media, right?
Yeah. And then there's a point in the movie where Ben and Jason Burke, Lou Ayres, are in a car together, and Ben is talking about how Susan has gotten a job offer, and Jason Burke says, "Yeah, I heard about that," and it's like, how did you hear about that? Like how small is this town? And you have Weasel Phillips, who's just like constantly watching and listening to everything, but like everybody is judging everybody. But it's so fascinating to me that all that stuff, is kind of going on, but all that small town stuff. What I was going to say was, the weird thing about complaining about the pace of this movie is that at some point about halfway through, it just becomes a nonstop onslaught of horror sequences that doesn't stop until the thing's over. Pretty
much, yeah. And for me, like, I don't like, if you just had that part of the movie, like if this movie just picked up where like, Barlow is here and it's just like body after body after body is piling up, like, where's the buildup?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, why would we care that all these people are being annihilated by this force?
No, absolutely.
And so for me, like I'm old school. Like I want to care about these characters. I want to feel something when something happens to them. And it's like, and you see, the Glick boys getting, Ralphie being taken, Danny being,
Right.
attacked, Danny
Right.
then going after Mark.
Right.
Those things need to feel like they matter to me. Like they're not
Yeah.
just set pieces.
Right. Right. No,
And
I
I
mean,
think that's what I love about it.
I don't. It was a recent. There was a tweet that went kind of viral because I can't remember who it was, but somebody basically saying that it was a horror writer, and he was basically saying like, look, the idea here, if you're writing a horror screenplay, is if the horror didn't intrude on the drama could play all the way out, and you would still have something compelling. You would still have something interesting to watch. And I think that that's what you have with Salem's Lot. You have this great small town. You have this guy coming back, which is always great. Like as soon as you have, the prodigal son character, as Jason Burke says about Ben, coming back to his hometown, he's made it big, and he's a different person, and he's very liberal, and this is kind of a small conservative town. That's all great stuff. That's fascinating stuff. And like you said about them falling in love and her ex-boyfriend, and I mean, you could just make a show just about that and have just Ben just being haunted by this house, and have absolutely no Barlow and Straker coming antique shop and basically destroying the town. You could have it without any of that happening, and it would still be very compelling. I would watch it. I would watch that show.
Yeah, me too. What's interesting, I want to jump on that point because you mentioned, of course, Ben Mears comes in. He's sort of this liberal writer who's made it big, coming back into this town. And, I think for me, one of my favorite sort of things is movies about writers, and specifically when Stephen King stories get turned into movies about writers, because there's something very telling about it.
Yeah.
And I always wondered, like, if that was sort of his way of working out some of his own feelings about, like, maybe how people perceived him in his community or things like that, because it is really interesting, because you could almost, because there's a part of the movie when David Soul says something like how this all started happening when he came back.
Right.
Almost like how his liberalism in a way has triggered all of these things to start happening in this town.
Right.
And, when you're sort of looking at where, at the time of when this story was written, when this movie was being made, we're coming out of Vietnam.
Yep.
And people had a lot of strong feelings in terms of what that war meant and what that war represented. Mm-hmm. It's a really if you look at it, if you take the supernatural elements out, it's a really fascinating study of almost sort of liberalism versus conservatism.
Yeah. Well,
at that time.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting, too, because you have not only do you have Ben, who, at one point the homophobic mom makes the comments about, Susan is nervous about telling her that the book is a gay love story about two men. Right. And then you have this Barlow, the implications of the Barlow relationship if they were not vampire and familiar.
Right.
They're partners, they're kind of companions, and there's talk about how they've come to this small town to retire together, and it's like, oh, interesting. But the reaction of the conservative town is, and they're opening an antique shop. You know what I mean? It's like a bunch of red flags for them. They all want to meet them because they're all like sophisticated. That's the thing about the small town aspect of it, is like, well, these are sophisticates. These are people, these are world, travelers and people that have known the world. And then there's Jason Burke. And at one point in the movie, after Mike Ryerson dies, Ben reads the riot act to Jason Burke about all of the implications of what's going to happen if people find out that this, younger guy died in his house, and he's telling crazy stories about vampires. But the implication is that he's a gay man and that he's going to get basically extricated. He's going to get run out of town on a rail. I think in the 2004 version, where I think Andre Braugher plays Jason Burke, he is closet homosexual. I think he might be, I think they make him gay, but nobody in town either acknowledges it or he hasn't come out yet. I can't remember how they handled it, but it's a very interesting turn because it really shows you how dangerous it is for him in that environment where he's a respected individual. He's a teacher. He's someone people trust with their children. But the minute that threat comes into the story, it's a really interesting. I actually don't mind the 2004 version. It's not anywhere near as good, but as another version of this, I think it's a perfectly good adaptation. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with class. There's a lot of what is it, the scene with Straker and Kenneth McMillan with Chow.
Oh, that's like the best. Like, first of all, James Mason is so amazing in this movie. Like, so I walk around with saying sort of his inflection of words so much. Like, you can't even believe how many times I can work the word candor into my conversations. I do it because of James Mason in this movie. Candor. Because I'm just like, he's like candor, and I'm just like, perfect. But yeah, that whole exchange, like, because it's like you have the initial one where Gillespie goes into the shop to talk to Strickland because he suspects him of taking little Ralphie Glick.
Yes.
And, and he ends with Chow, and then James Mason explains it to him. And then when they come back to sort of them coming back together and they're Gillespie's office, and then he says Chow, and Gillespie's like, oh, I remember. And it's just like, I mean, like, first of all, like, James Mason should have won like multiple awards.
Oh, he's so good.
Like,
he's so good.
It's just pitch perfect.
It is. It's great. No, and that delivery, Chow. Oh, it's an Italian word. Yes, I didn't realize you were Italian. I'm not. The word is.
It's just like, it's so. And what's great about that too is because you talk about sort of like the idea of like the familiar and the vampire, which there's a lot of elements that I would definitely say Fright Night. A lot to Salem's Lot in that regard.
Yes.
Of course, that would have to. Definitely a big aspect of that would be the relationship between Billy Cole and Jerry Dandridge, which is also very ambiguous in terms of sort of what their connection is. But I think for me, like, Billy Cole is sort of like Richard Straker, like amped up to like the 80s version of Richard Straker, where he's still messing with people.
Yes.
But in a way that you just don't quite know.
Right.
Which again, I think is like a testament to that character, but like even like their demise is pretty much the same. That's
the thing. It's really strange. So I had picked up on this a few years ago and really started kind of talking about it with friends and other horror, fans and horror nerds. And it was interesting because it just didn't seem like it was something that a lot of people had picked up on. And I was so, like I said, I went back through and I read all of your stuff, and I saw that you had you had done a whole article about Mark Petrie and Charlie Brewster.
Yeah.
Which was great. It was a really good article.
Oh, thank you.
And I was like, yep, because there's so much, and it's weird. Tom and Toby were close friends.
Yeah.
And in fact, when Toby died, there was a brief discussion about Tom coming in and doing White Zombie and just taking my script that Toby had tailored and directing it as is. It didn't happen, but they were very, very close, and I got to know Tom because of that. And so it was interesting because I did not know how close they were, but I've always wanted to ask him, like, you kind of stole a lot, and I didn't, because I've always loved Fright Night. I think Fright Night is a borderline perfect movie, and it really hit me at just the right time and just the right age, and I absolutely love Fright Night. Man, it took me a long time to pick up on all of the staircase. That staircase sequence with Billy Cole.
Yeah.
It's like the same shit. It's all, I mean, granted, he gets shot like 6 times and, that whole bit, but there's so much other stuff. And like you said, I mean, the biggest thing being the Mark Petrie, Charlie Brewster, the idea that Mark knows the things that Mark is being kind of chastised for and end up saving his life, and that he knows horror, he knows how to stop vampires. It's wild, all of them, but there's so many little details, including the house, the kind of psycho-ish house.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that stuff. And so, no, I don't know. And there's a lot of psycho in Salem's Lot, by the way, which is another. So it's weird because then there's a movie that has a huge influence on Salem's Lot. And I'm always thrown by how much psycho is in Salem's Lot. And then there's Nosferatu with the Barlow look, which is not from the book at all. That entire interpretation of the character is unique to the miniseries.
Yeah, I remember when I went back and reread the book a few years ago. It didn't really dawn on me, but like because I used to steal my mom's like Stephen King books when I was a kid,
Sure.
and I'd read them and then put them back in her stash of books.
Yeah.
I totally had forgotten that Barlow in the book is like he talks.
Yep.
He's like he looks normal. He's
Yep.
kind of like a suave Dracula type dude.
Yep.
And it's obviously in the miniseries, he's very animalistic. He's very gray blue,
Right.
and very otherworldly, which is such a departure. But I'm actually kind of glad because I don't think when you have a character like Straker to balance him out, you don't need him to talk.
Nope. And it's, I can't take credit for this. This was something else that John Kenneth Muir pointed out, but it's a very Tobe relationship between a consistent element that you see in Tobe's work, the Straker Barlow relationship. If you look at the Cook and Leatherface.
Okay.
If you look at the Barker and Gunther in Funhouse. If you look at Mrs. McKelch and the Martians in Invaders from Mars, he has this consistent idea of the beard, the normal person who can interact with the normals and kind of pave the way for the monster. And then there's the monster, and the monster is this monosyllabic, thing that doesn't speak. It's a beast. It's animal. It's primal. And it's a consistent thing through. And it's interesting because I don't know that Tobe, the script for this. I don't know Paul Monash wrote the script, and it's weird. Paul Monash produced Carrie, and I think he wrote an early draft of the script, but the script ended up being credited to someone else. So I guess Paul Monash was just in the Stephen King business at that point. But I think that the Nosferatu thing was either Paul Monash's idea or Richard Kobritz's idea. So I think it's just a coincidence, or it's just something that Tobe kind of latched onto because it was just one of his things. I never actually asked him about it because I never really picked up on the consistency of it. But there is this consistency of kind of a handler, a keeper, someone who can interact with people, and this, beast creature that is completely out of control. I mean, there's even a point in this where, and I've always been kind of curious about the scene where Ned Tebbets and Mike Ryerson don't lock up
the house,
the crate and the house. And when James Mason comes home, when Straker comes home, he's got the kid,
Ralphie, yeah.
He's got Ralphie wrapped up in plastic, which is so, oh my God, the idea that was on television in 1979 is mind blowing to me. But he's terrified.
He realizes if the monster is loose.
Yeah, because he's just out there. He's completely off the chain. He's not in a box.
It's interesting because you have to wonder, so what would have lured him back? Was it the offering of Ralphie Glick?
Just the sun coming up? I mean, I don't know. But there is kind of a weird hole there because I don't exactly know. He seems nervous, but then he seems kind of overjoyed that he's got the kid, that he's got this meal for his master. But he is when he comes in and finds that crate, that wrecked crate, he's terrified. The look on his face is, oh shit. And his instructions are so specific.
They are. And it's even interesting too, because even during the scene before he calls Crockett to come over with all the instructions, he plays it very nervously. Even when he leaves for the antique store that day, there's a very nervous energy to James Mason's performance, in those scenes, which is really fascinating. And it's one of those things I think maybe because I've watched it so many times, but you don't always normally notice those little ticks that kind of come along. And again, I think it's such a testament to what he was able to do with that character, where it's just even when as eloquent and as fascinating as Straker is, there's so much to that performance that is unsaid.
Oh yeah.
And just comes through his body language, which is just brilliant.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And then there are things that happen off screen, and you have to try to imagine James Mason Straker doing them, which is really interesting. There's a lot of stuff that happens off screen and it's funny because it's such a, visceral, in your face movie that we don't see, and a lot of them have to do with whatever Straker is doing behind the scenes. He takes Bonnie Bedelia away at one point, to feed her to Barlow, and we don't see what happens.
Yeah, and I've always wondered about that sequence too, because it is still during daylight.
Yep.
And technically, when they go down to the basement, like Barlow's back asleep in his cozy little coffin.
Yeah.
So it's like, does Straker have to wake him up? Like,
I don't know.
It's to me, I've always wondered about that, because it's, because he says, like, I took her, to meet the man she came here to meet. And
right. Right.
And it's such an interesting sort of part of that finale, because I've always wondered, like, he's already back in, he's already like asleep to the point where he doesn't realize his coffin's being dragged out.
Right.
And based on the timing of everything, that's only within like a 20-minute time span.
Right.
That really all of this stuff kind of like starts to unfold. Like, we're not talking like hours.
No.
So I've always wondered about that, because, it's a pretty quick wrap up in terms of everything else. And I've always kind of wondered, like, well, does he like, is it just like a quick nibble and she goes into the pit like with everybody else? Like, I've always wondered the logistics of that whole scenario.
Right. Well, and then the tragedy of Susan as a character, because she is on the verge of basically leaving town at just the right time.
Yeah.
And if it weren't for Ben,
freedom. Yeah.
Yeah. If it weren't for Ben, it seems like she probably would have gotten out for all the right reasons before it turned into Vampire Land.
Well, technically, though, because so she goes to Boston for her interview.
Right.
And then, he tells her to leave, and she's doing everything he tells her to do in terms of going and seeing if she can, find other people to leave.
Right.
And then she sees Mark go into the house.
Right.
So it's almost like her sense, like, I don't know if it's like her maternal instinct, like if we're supposed to get the implication of her maternal instincts.
Right.
Or just her being a good person.
Right.
But
and then she climbs up the hill like Vera Miles does at the end of Psycho. She kind of does that weird kind of half crawl up the hill. It's weird. There are so many shots. There's this shot of Ed Flanders walking up the steps, and all the shots of him walking up the steps that are Martin Balsam walking up the steps. They're recreations. And there's the overhead shot of James Mason attacking Ed Flanders. And, it's weird, but there's all this Psycho stuff in there on top of everything else. It's a fascinating movie. Oh, and one of the other things I was going to say about Bonnie Bedelia, and this is always, so I always like finding, one of the things that I do that we didn't mention earlier is that I co-host, I've been co-hosting Dead Right Horror Trivia with Rebecca McKendry for years and years now. And, so one of my things is that my brain is just always finding connections and themes, and because it's good for trivia, it's good to come up with things that match up. And so it's something I can't stop myself from doing. And one of the things that I love about Bonnie Bedelia being in this movie is that Bonnie Bedelia is also in Needful Things.
Oh, yes.
And Needful Things is basically Salem's Lot without vampire.
Gosh, I never even really realized that, but it so is, isn't it?
Yeah. It's really interesting, and her being in it is a complete coincidence. And then, of course, if you want to go even further, Ed Harris plays Alan Pangborn in Needful Things. Alan Pangborn is played by Michael Rooker in The Dark Half, which stars Amy Madigan, who is Mrs. Ed Harris.
Oh my goodness, that's
I'll stop on my Needful Things weirdness tip there. But yeah, the Bonnie Bedelia, the Bonnie Bedelia being in both is very strange. It's very, very strange. And it's like 10 years apart. Needful Things is like 90 or 91 or something. Like it's there's a huge gap.
I almost want to start breaking down all of these casts from all these different Stephen King adaptations. And I want to turn into Charlie from It's Always Sunny and just start like mapping out. So who is
yarn and a bulletin board and some tacks and nails.
Yeah, because you're like, okay, well, even though it's not like technically his books, but like Ed Harris is in Creepshow, and then he's over in this. And
right.
Oh, yeah.
Right. No, it's fantastic, and it never adds up to anything, but it's so fan. But I love all that stuff, and I did a trivia question not that long ago about how Sheriff Bannerman, who's played by Tom Skerritt in The Dead Zone, is a character in Cujo, which also came out that year, played by an entirely different person.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize that. Wow.
Yeah.
I guess I have to brush up on my Stephen King trivia. Here I thought I was good. Now I know I'm not.
Oh, you're good. You would clean up. I would be, if I were on a team up against you, I would be terrified. Trust me. But yeah, whenever I think about, Salem's Lot, though, it's always the scares, and it's always, oh God, the Barlow, the first appearance of Barlow in what's his name's Ned Tebbett's jail cell.
Yeah, because that's the first time we really get any sort of sense of what he is and what he even looks like.
And it's funny,
shadows before that.
Everybody, and it's always the head popping up into the extreme close-up that everybody always kind of talks about and remembers. For me, it's that hand gesture that he does that unlocks the door. Mm-hmm. That creeps me out.
It's very like hypnotic. Like,
yeah.
It's like you're going under hypnosis.
Yeah. But it's just this really quick shot of that Jedi, Jedi, the Force push to get the door open. And I love that so much. I love that detail.
Yeah, I love the kitchen scene too.
Oh.
And Mark Petrie's when Father Callahan is meeting with his parents, and they're talking about Mark's penchant for horror movies and how that's making him imagine that his dead friend is showing up at his window as a vampire.
Right.
Because that's the logical.
Of course.
But I mean, just I still remember, like, just you see that puddle. It's almost like the reverse Wicked Witch.
Right.
Like you see the puddle of this like black cloak on the floor.
Yep.
Barlow just comes up so slowly. And it's still like, it sounds so crazy, but it is still one of my favorite sequences in that movie, just because it's a great, how did they do that moment?
Yeah. No, I know. And it's the buildup.
Oh,
It's the buildup to the reveal too that just does it, because it's the whole room shaking and all the plates clanking and all the silverware and everything shaking in the kitchen, and and the camera's floating. The camera's doing this tracking thing, and it's on like a crane or something overhead, and it's so, and the music and everything is building up, and then like you said, that black thing just kind of flies through the window and starts unfolding on the floor, and it's like, what the fuck is that? What is that? And then this thing stands up, and it's just so terrifying. That sequence blows my mind. I had a screenplay where I basically ripped that scene off, and I didn't think anybody would notice. And there was a really keen kind of horror. He was a horror savvy director that was briefly attached to the project, and he read the script and he had all his notes he wanted to talk about, and he was like, "So did you just rip this scene off from Salem's Lot?" Like, yeah. And he's like, "Okay, good. I'm glad that we know this. I'm glad that we mutually agree that you ripped off this scene from Salem's Lot, because that scene, the kids scratching at the window, and like I said, there's so many traumatic moments, but I think that the scene in the kitchen it's so well done and so scary, and the buildup is so terrifying. But then he immediately kills Mark's parents.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something, once again, with Tobe, all bets are off, that you cannot trust. We have killed both of his parents in one shot right in front of this kid.
Yeah. And I was going to say, also in connection with the kitchen scene, like, because, with Texas Chainsaw, like, there's a sense of like invading somebody else's property, so you're almost inviting danger, and you're, inviting this threat. But what I think is really interesting when you look at the kitchen scene in Salem's Lot, and then you think about Poltergeist,
yep,
and how all these things start to happen. I know the TV ends up sort of being like the catalyst,
Right.
but the first scene where we really see things are going weird in that house is the kitchen.
Yep.
Because that's where the families come together. That's where your safety is.
Yeah.
And if, I would love to see somebody sort of break down those two kitchen set pieces, because I think, for as much as people like to say, like, Tobe was like this, like visceral, blah, blah. I think for me, like, what's really great about who he was as a director was that he could bring it into these really safe spaces for viewers. And I think that's why it was so effective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know that he regularly told the story about, because one of the inspirations, and Poltergeist is a whole other that's a whole other 4-hour discussion. But Poltergeist was initiated by him. Spielberg came to him with the sequel to Close Encounters, the Night Skies.
Night Skies.
And Tobe didn't want to do Night Skies. He wanted to do a ghost movie, and so they started talking about ghost movies. But one of the reasons that Tobe had been obsessed with ghost movies was that he had a relative or someone had died in his family, and they almost immediately started having poltergeist activity in the house.
Whoa.
And one of the stories that he told me was that there was a day when all of the plates in the kitchen shattered on their own. And they were not in the kitchen when it happened, but they came in and there was just porcelain all over the place, just shattered porcelain all over the place. And so I'm not surprised that scary kitchens, figure into Tobe's, psychology and in his filmography as much as they do, because he always told that story. He always said flat out, like he had poltergeist activity and stuff flying around, and obvious ghost evidence on a regular basis. Once whoever it was, I can't remember if it was his father or who it was that had passed away, but he said it was like immediate. It was within a day or two after the death that stuff started flying around the house and they started hearing noises. And but I'm not shocked that that's where that happens. And I whenever anybody gets into the whole, who directed Poltergeist thing, which I always is like, well, Tobe Hooper directed Poltergeist, and that's the end. That's the beginning and the end of the story. But I always, if it goes further than that, I usually bring up sequences and I bring up visuals and I bring up other things in Tobe's filmography. And if you want to talk about how can you say that Tobe Hooper directed Poltergeist, look at the kitchen sequence in Salem's Lot and tell me that guy did not direct Poltergeist.
Yeah, exactly.
Because come on. It's so obviously the same guy. It's so obviously from the same mind and the same, filmmaker. And so, I will sometimes watch Salem's Lot just to get to that sequence, because I love that sequence so much, and I find it so fascinating. And then the confrontation between the priest and Straker is so fascinating to me. I still to this day don't really understand what faith against faith means.
I think it was because it was something. It is partly. It was something in the book as well, where I think it was just the priest really believed that his religious background would be effective to stop the evil.
Okay.
And I mean, but we all know, like, a priest isn't going to do anything against a vampire. Like, right. demon possessed little girls, sure.
Right.
But what are they going to do with a vampire? But I think ultimately, if you're treating this as somebody who, maybe has no context of what vampirism is, or they just know them as like this, like, force of evil,
right?
Like that maybe, like, even, because he makes him drop the crucifix,
right?
Which we of course know is a big no-no when it comes to vampires. Like, you need to hold on to your vampire. And I think
right.
Also, when you think about that too, is look at Fright Night.
Right.
And
you have to have faith.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how faith is sort of this tool against vampirism, but it can't conquer it. It can only sort of subdue it.
Right.
Ultimately, like that priest, Father Callahan's going to die regardless.
Right.
So I think it was just a matter of time for him either way. And I'm pretty sure that's how it kind of works out in the book too.
Right.
But yeah, it's an interesting idea of, if God can save you from vampires, because I don't think he can. I think it's just
No, absolutely. No way. And I loved James Mason in that scene. Is just having the time of his life. He is so relishing that moment and standing there next to, and one of the other things Toby told me is that nobody could see in those lenses.
Oh, I could only imagine, because they even, I mean, and this is something I know from talking to Steve Johnson, who worked on Fright Night. They had the same exact problem with them.
Yeah.
Because I remember like Steve saying how he had sort of done what he thought was like the first painted lenses, but I was like, no, I'm pretty sure that they did them before that.
Right.
Which then, upon doing further digging and stuff into special effects stuff, I know that they did painted lenses for Salem's Lot too.
Right.
And I mean, I had to have regular sort of weird contacts in, because like years ago I did a event where for the home release of Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse, they had me go into Alterian and they turned me into a zombie for a day.
Very
and
nice.
I got to like interview Tony Gardner as a vampire, or as a zombie, which was a trip. But I've had a weird thing about putting stuff in my eyes, like
me too.
As a kid. So I've always worn glasses.
Same.
And the whole day I was like, you guys aren't putting contacts in me. You're just not going to do it.
Right.
And so the lens technician doctor gets there, because you have to have a special doctor.
Right.
And he's like, all right. He's like, we're going to do this. And I was like, no, we're not. And he's like, we're going to do it. You're going to be fine. And I'll tell you, I had those things in my eyes for 10 minutes and I was so uncomfortable. And they're soft lenses, they're sterile. They're, they're like, modern. So they shouldn't, I was like, no, get them out. Like, right. So I can't even imagine what people used to have to put up with those things.
Yeah. Well, and they're doing that. They're doing that lighting effect too. They're using that reflective material, that same stuff like the Superman, the Kryptonians have that reflective material. They also originally used it on the lightsabers in the first Star Wars.
Yeah.
Before they animated over them with the opticals, but it's this reflective material that you shine a light, and the light basically kind of mirrors. So it doesn't look like anything on set, but it looks amazing when you're looking through the lens. And so they're using that stuff, or some equivalent of that stuff, in people's eyes. It's wild. It's not an optical effect. It's it's a lighting effect that's being done on set. And nobody could see. Apparently there were some injuries to eyes and some infections to eyes. So I won't get into it because that'll freak you out. But he did tell me that. But just that nobody could see. So if you see Barlow doing anything, he doesn't know what he's doing. He has absolutely no idea what's around him. People had to kind of step in. They said that, and help and hold people up, sure that they knew where they were standing, but they were basically blind. If they were on set and wearing those contact lenses, they were completely blind. They had no vision whatsoever, which is, I can't even imagine when you look at those scenes and how scary they are and how effective they are. And then you figure into it like, oh, okay, Bonnie Bedelia in this scene cannot see.
Well, that's even like, I was thinking about like, because another one like this always messed me up is like, why I just hate like dark rooms that like you just kind of open a door and you're like, what's in here? And then the scene with Mike Ryerson in Jason Burke's house where he's sitting in the rocking chair and he's looking down and then you
look
just
at
see
me.
the eyes. And I'm just like, oh, Jesus, no.
That scene is that's another piece of goddamn nightmare fuel if I've ever. Man, oh man, look at me. It's so scary. It's so good. And I love that they're kind of half zombie. I love that it's kind of got a Savini, Dawn of the Dead, they're kind of blue and turning green, and it's so gross. But yeah, his performance. I mean, it's funny. He's such a convincing vampire that I don't think anybody gives Jeffrey Lewis credit for how good of how varied a performance and how good of a performance he gives in that movie.
Oh,
because
I know.
His vampire is so different from Mike Ryerson. His vampire version of Mike is so different from the guy, this simple guy, this annoying guy that we get to know. And he's got the scene where he finds his dog and he breaks down. It's like, this is a great performance. The weirdo thing, another weirdo thing happened. I coincidentally was watching Trilogy of Terror 2 recently. I got it on Blu-ray and I hadn't watched it in years. And in the first segment of that movie, it's another it's another Dan Curtis anthology. Jeffrey Lewis plays a gravedigger.
I never put that together.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funnier in that movie because he is, and it's interesting because he plays it almost the same way as Mike Ryerson, but he's a joke in town because he keeps showing up with new coats and new rings. And it's because he's, before he buries people, he goes, pops the coffins open and just kind of takes stuff from them. It's a great character, but it's really interesting. There is a scene in Trilogy of Terror 2 where he falls down into a grave, an open grave on top of a casket. And I was like, okay, there's now we're getting to homages to homages at this point. But yeah, he's so good. Everybody's great. Ed Flanders is great in it. George Zunza is great in it. They've got the Alicia Cook and what's her name are basically like reprising their roles from Kubrick's The Killing.
Marie Windsor.
Marie Windsor. So weird. The cuckold couple, the firecracker and the put upon cuckold, who doesn't have he's way out of his depth, married to this woman. I love that it's like them afterwards, that they still live together, but they're not married anymore and they're not a couple anymore. But it's such a cool that those characters are so great, but now the performances are so it's such a great movie.
Definitely. And I still remember to this day, like the feeling of sitting in the theater with Devil's Rejects, because I admit, like, I wasn't always like one of those people who could always put people together.
Right.
But I remember sitting in the theater, and I think maybe the last time I had really seen something that Jeffrey Lewis was in was, it might've been an episode of X-Files, or It could have been, I think, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which I saw in theaters because I was like all about John Cusack movies during that phase of my life. But I still remember, like, when Roy Sullivan pops up for the first time in Devil's Rejects, I got so excited because I was like, oh my God, it's Mike Ryerson from Salem's Lot. And I know for a fact that I was the only person sitting in that packed theater who thought that in that moment.
Yep.
But I was so excited. And every time, like, I see him, I just always been like, bless the little bunnies. Like, it's like, I just associated with that so much. But he was amazing. And I was like, one of the things I got to do, like in the last few years, I got to interview Juliette Lewis, for Mon for this project she did with Blumhouse that was on Facebook.
Okay.
And we actually talked about her dad a little bit because I wanted to make it about her, but I mean, her dad had such a legacy, and it's really cool that, she's got to build a legacy of her own.
Yeah.
But she was just saying, like, how he always said one of the very favorite things he ever did was Salem's Lot.
That's great to hear.
That made me feel really good, where I was like, oh, okay, good. Like, because I'd hate to hear that he had like a terrible time, and and there was maybe him and Toby didn't get along. But I guess she said it was like one of the very favorite things that he got to do. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, he brought her to set for a few days on that.
Oh wow, that's intense.
Came up she came up to Northern California.
Right.
Him shooting on that, which is pretty cool.
Right. Oh, that's amazing. That's really good to hear. And I've never heard a bad word about Jeffrey Lewis. I've heard he was just a sweet, sweet guy. And that's fantastic. I was going to mention also the restaurant. I don't know if you knew this. The bar restaurant scenes where Ben and Jason Burke go and have dinner, and then Jeffrey Lewis, Mike shows up kind of wasted because he's had his, he's been drained of blood. It's the Van Nuys Elks Lodge.
It is not. Is it really?
Yeah. And it is virtually unchanged.
Oh my God. I never wanted to go somewhere so much in my life.
It's unbelievable. I have been there for I did. We had like a horror so I wrote an essay about Creepshow for this book called My Favorite Horror Movie, which was edited by a guy named Christian Ackerman, who's just an amazing guy. And he just keeps firing off these projects and books and different things. And as soon as he knows that you're into something, you're like on his list and you constantly get called in for stuff. So we had a signing of My Favorite Horror Movie there, and I immediately picked up on it. And somebody told me, like, yeah, this is the restaurant from Salem's Lot. And then I also did a reading of an unproduced Larry Cohen script there called The Man Who Loved Hitchcock. And with Tom Holland played Alfred Hitchcock, and Harry Manfredini played Bernard Herrmann. But it was a great night. But we were there, and it's just now, whenever he's got an event there, I am dying to go. To the point where even that there's, if you remember, and this is really obscure, and we're getting super nerdy, and it's getting late now, and we're getting punchy. But there's like a star kind of sconce on the wall. It's like this thing that's kind of.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
It's still there.
Really?
Yeah, at least it was a year ago, the last time I was there.
Oh my gosh. How do I click into there right now?
Unchanged. They have not changed. This is one of those old places with old people in it. It's like a veterans hall, basically. They've got all the medals on the walls, and they've got all this stuff. It is unchanged. The layout is the same. The booths are the same. Some of the booths and tables were there for dressing to make it look more like a restaurant.
Right.
But it is the same.
Oh my gosh. When we get through all of this nonsense, I want to have an event there. Like, I don't know what I have to do, but I'm going to figure out a way to book the Elks Lodge.
We need to have a screening of Salem's Lot.
Yes.
There.
I'm so on board for that. I know it's like, because I know like the movie, they use this a small town in way Northern California named Ferndale as sort of the backdrop for Salem's Lot, which I've always wanted to go up there. But it's like, even though we're in the same state, like that might as well be 4 states away without because it's almost all the way up by Oregon at that point. So it's like one of those, like, it's a pilgrimage I've always wanted to make, and I've just never been able to do it yet.
Me either.
But I can get to Van Nuys.
Yes.
Van Nuys is easy. I can do that.
Yeah.
So
but I was blown away. I raced home after we were done and put on the Blu-ray, and I was showing my girlfriend like, oh, there's that and there's that. And we couldn't believe that it still looks exactly the same.
Oh, that is amazing. Like, that just made my night. So I guess kind of probably a good sort of stopping point for this week, because last year they announced that they were going to be doing another Salem's Lot.
Right.
Which I'm cool with, Sure. It's easy. For me, like, when the people go back and they redo Stephen King movies, a lot of folks immediately call them remakes. To me, they're just new adaptations, because I don't call every iteration of Romeo and Juliet a remake, because it's just a new take on the story.
I agree with you.
But I am very excited that James Wan is producing. And I know Gary Dauberman is writing, and I guess he was announced at some point early on in the pandemic that he was going to be directing as well.
Yeah, no one knows the fate of the movie, but I saw that as well. He was attached. I think he had kind of parlayed his successes into getting the directing position on it. So I'm excited. I'm the same as you, and it's funny, like with all the Carrie remakes and stuff. It's like, well, I almost feel like with Carrie, it's like, well, it's almost like a stage play. It's like, okay, at this point, every 8 or 10 years, you get 2 awesome actresses to come in and do Carrie White and Margaret White. Like, why not? I don't, I mean, they're not going to be as good as the De Palma version, but I don't see a problem with it. And I don't see a problem with, we've had Return to Salem's Lot. We've had the 2004 version of Salem's Lot with Rob Lowe. I have no problem with them. I mean, there's always that outcry. It's as though the original version is being damaged in some way or being, deleted. But it's like, no, it's fine. It's still there on the shelf. It'll still stream on Shudder from time to time. It's not hurting the original in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, people might actually seek it out of curiosity. If they like the new one, they might want to check out the old one. So no, I'm all for it. I think it'll be interesting. I always like seeing variations and seeing what people come up with to do. And I, as a guy who's written some remakes and written some things that have been done to, capitalize on older properties, I can't be against them, but I also don't see the harm in it. So I'm all for it.
I would say even like when It Chapter 1 came out, like how many people went back and watched that original miniseries?
Totally.
And I think they like Warner actually put out like the brand new Blu-ray because they realized like, oh, people are going to want to see this, so it was nice to actually get that on Blu-ray finally.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows, like if they, in a few years, if we actually finally get like a new Salem's Lot, maybe we'll actually get this other stuff that we were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
Of the episode,
that would be amazing. A special edition with the different cuts, with the 4 different cuts.
Yeah. So if you happen to be listening right now, Warner Archive Collection executives, like I am available to work on special features and dive into these things. I'm more than willing. You don't even have to pay me actually at this point. Like I will come in and do it for free. Because I think there's an ultimate version of a release of this movie to come out. I mean, I think to a degree, Scream Factory had been working a little bit with Warner Brothers stuff, but
They had.
But I know the Warner Archive Collection's been doing so well. I think maybe Warner's kind of focusing on that, especially these days when they don't have a ton of new movies to be putting out.
Right.
So it's interesting, but there is still, I think there is a definitive release of this, and that, and I'm happy to have the Blu-ray I have. I love that it's on Shudder because it's so many people have been watching it over the last couple of weeks, which is
it's crazy. It's crazy.
Like
I love
every day I come on and there's somebody new tweeting about Salem's Lot.
Yep. Fantastic.
I have a friend, Chantal Handley, who just, she sort of reposted some Barlow artwork that she did, which is amazing and gorgeous and scary. And that thing like blew up on Twitter. So it's really cool to see that, this story and these characters, 41 years later are still enduring. Whether or not the kids think it's a too slow of a movie, it's still out there. It's still part of the discussion amongst fans. And that to me is what, I think if nothing else, like, I feel like that would really make Toby happy, is to know
I do too.
41 years later,
like
people are still talking about this movie a lot.
And it's a very important, it was something that he loved, and it was something that was a very important movie for his career. So I think that he would be right there. He would be ecstatic right now. Yeah. He really would.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like that is sort of that is like our moment. I think that is our Toby moment for this episode. But Jared, first of all, thank you so much for doing this and for coming on and chatting about Salem's Lot.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Do you want to give people sort of a shout out where they can find you online?
I think I'm on Twitter as the Jared Rivet 1. I think I kind of went to the simple whatever came up first. So I think I'm just Jared Rivet 1 on there. And keep an eye out on earbudtheater.com. I do a lot of stuff for Earbud Theater. I do a lot of audio dramas for earbudtheater.com. And I wrote an episode of the upcoming Day of the Dead TV series for the Sci-Fi Channel, and they're filming that in Canada now. During the pandemic, they've been quarantining and doing everything right, and so they're going to have that show out presumably sometime in 2021. So that'll be something to look forward to.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for doing this. And for those of you listening, thank you so much for supporting Corpse Club. To find out more about Corpse Club, you can visit us over at corpseclub.com. And for all of your daily news, reviews, interviews, and features, you can head over to dailydead.com or follow us over on Twitter at dailydeadnews. To our engineer, Brian, thank you so much for making us sound awesome. And until next time, everybody, stay scary.